fast forward a couple of years, we're out of the cannabis industry, me and my co-founders, and we just stumble upon psychedelics. We have a conversation with someone about psychedelics who described her first experience with psilocybin as being like 10 years of therapy in a single afternoon. Having done my work with meditation and therapy, I just had this realization that psychedelics could be the platform that opens up the conversations around meditation, spirituality, emotionality to a whole audience of people who aren't paying attention to it, who won't pay attention to it. And so on the back of that conversation, those moments of inspiration and my first ever psychedelic experience, which happened after that one conversation, I was like, okay, yeah, this is transformative. This is probably the most important thing I could be working on in my life. And so here we are.
All right. Hi, sweet Ziva friends. You are in for such a treat today. I am so excited to talk about something that I have alluded to, hinted to, talked around, but never really um, dove into head first. And I'm really excited to be doing that with one of the trailblazers, one of the people who have really gone deep into this space and are really helping to make it accessible to more folks. So please welcome Mr. Ronan Levvy, who I met a few years ago at this beautiful entrepreneur group. We met in Cabo in Mexico. And I remember we had a quick chat, but I remember being so excited about what he was up to. And today he's actually here because he's got a new journal, which I'm really excited about. So before we even go into this subject, because it can be a little controversial, a little inflammatory, a little people get defensive around this stuff. And so before we even say what we're here to talk about, which is probably very curiosity inducing, I want to just invite you to remember how you felt before you ever started meditating. What happened to you as you went through this meditation process, the catharsis, the purge, the emotions, the sorrow, the rage, and then how your life changed on the other side, how the integration of that practice into your life changed on the other side, and then how that changed the lens through which you see reality. So Ronan is working with something very similar, something that requires preparation, that can shift your state of consciousness in big ways, and that requires integration on the other side. And he's really been on the forefront of helping to bring psychedelic assisted therapy into the mainstream. He created a company called Field Trip, and it is really growing. It started in Canada and now is in the US, and is really helping to integrate psychotherapy with psychedelics. And now today, I'm gonna let him talk about this, but he is sharing because he has a new book called the Trip Journal. Isn't it so beautiful? The Trip Journal, which we'll talk about in a moment, but psychedelic experiences, therapy, meditation, vipassana, going to Burning Man, like all of these things are amazing. They can change your consciousness, but if you don't integrate it, then the lessons can get lost. And then you keep going back, going back, going back. And what we certainly don't want to do in this new revolution is create more addicts. And that can happen if we don't integrate the lessons, if we just try and get more and more and more. And so I just want to say thank you for creating the Trip Journal to help people integrate. So I'd love to just ask you, why on earth did you get into psychedelic assisted therapy? Did you have a personal breakthrough? Like what was that like for you?
Sure. Where to start? I've been a meditator, so to speak, for a long time, and I've had some transformative experiences through meditation. Just eye-opening revelations about the trauma I was carrying and how it had informed how I'd been living my life. And that was through my early 30s. I don't want to date myself right now, but I'm in my early 40s right now. And so this is about 10 years ago, and it's like, wow. And I can point to those moments, and they fundamentally changed the arc of my life. In parallel, I found myself as a kid who was not into drugs growing up, working in the cannabis industry. And philosophically, I was like, if people want to smoke pot, cool. But I was dubious as to the medical applications of cannabis. I was like, yeah, medical cannabis. And then I got into the cannabis industry, and we opened clinics helping people access the legal medical cannabis system in Canada. And my eyes were opened. I was like, oh my God, this is real medicine. These are people who are genuinely suffering, who are being made a lot better, whose lives are improving significantly through cannabis medicine. And it changed my eyes and my worldview to plant-based medicine. Fast forward a couple of years, we're out of the cannabis industry, me and my co-founders, and we just stumble upon psychedelics. We have a conversation with someone about psychedelics who described her first experience with psilocybin as being like 10 years of therapy in a single afternoon. Having done my work with meditation and therapy, I just had this realization that psychedelics could be the platform that opens up the conversations around meditation, spirituality, emotionality to a whole audience of people who aren't paying attention to it, who won't pay attention to it. I always had the idea of a 28-year-old dude in Pittsburgh who I could guarantee would rather be dead than ever caught in a therapist's office. And I asked myself, could I get that guy to try mushrooms? Probably. And if I can get him to try mushrooms, then I can change the direction of his life. Not to say psychedelics are a panacea or anything along those lines, but they can create that wedge and open people up. And so on the back of that conversation, those moments of inspiration and my first ever psychedelic experience, which happened after that one conversation, I was like, okay, yeah, this is transformative. This is probably the most important thing I could be working on in my life. And so here we are.
And do you mind sharing, I don't know if this is too personal, but like in your first session or in your subsequent sessions, like what insights have come? What has healed for you? Like what has changed in your personal worldview through doing this work with plant medicine?
I don't think we have time to go through all of that, to be quite
You think you
honest.
did a top one
But
or the most surprising
yeah.
or
Okay. So the probably the most profound realization I've had through my work with plant medicine is actually an experience on mescaline on San Pedro. As actually we're making a documentary on psychedelics as part of this journey, I put myself through a whole bunch of experiences and recorded it to give people a sense of what it actually looks like for average people. Not that I'm necessarily, but I'm not amongst the edge cases of people dealing with extreme PTSD or anything along those lines, or severe depression or anything along those lines. I'm just like, I got my stuff. Everybody does, but otherwise, I'm pretty typical. And during this experience on mescaline at San Pedro, the facilitator asked us to start stomping our feet. Right. And I started stomping my feet, and I got this distinct sense of being like a soldier, because we're almost marching. And at that moment, I realized I've never felt big in my life. I've never felt strong in my life. I've always been the small guy. I've always been trying to swing above my weight class to compensate for the fact, A, that I'm not a big guy at the best of times. I'm 5'9", 145 pounds. But as a kid, I went to school a year ahead of myself. So being a small guy, but then being the small guy because everyone was older than me, I quickly adapted to that role. And so all my life, I've been trying to compensate for that feeling of not being big enough, not being strong enough, not being good enough. And I had no idea I was doing that. I had no idea that was my modus operandi. And it's one of those things where if you name it, you can claim it. If you feel it, you can heal it. And all of a sudden it's like, oh, that was there all along. And now that I've realized this was just about a year ago, actually, that this happened. I've been able to very consciously work with that now to shift it. And it's been totally profound.
Wow. Wow. Yes. Thank you for sharing that. And it brings up of like, yeah, how on earth could you even take something to your therapist if you don't know that it's an issue? How on earth could you have the conversation with your mom if you didn't even know that you were hiding something or lying something? I had a very different experience. I've done San Pedro one time. I've done ayahuasca once and San Pedro once when they were on the same weekend. I felt like the Aya was very much like cleaning out. It was a purge. It was like a carving out of darkness. And then we filled that spaciousness with joy in the San Pedro ceremony. And beforehand, the shaman looked at me and he had read he had done our human design and pulled cards and things. And he said, oh, interesting. Last time someone with your human design pulled this card, she had a 3-hour energetic orgasm. And I was like, huh. And then cut to right on schedule. I had a 3-hour energy orgasm. And I was like, is there any such thing as free will, or is it all just predetermined? It was wild. So, very different healings, but like a good example of like same medicine, very different experiences depending on the person and where they are. Like I've been in the process of this very profound sexual awakening over the last 2 years and discovering like our own endogenous pharmacology, which can be just as powerful as the external pharmacology, certainly when you start to deal with potent, stuff like sacred sexuality. So anyway, so thank you for doing this work. Can you tell us a little bit about field trip and about what it is and like what it looks like when people want to go and do ketamine assisted therapy.
Yeah, we started Field Trip, but when you and I met, Field Trip was just a kernel of an idea a few years ago, but we built the infrastructure to help make psychedelic assisted therapies accessible, not just to people, but also the medical community who may look at this and like, that sounds like illicit drug use. I'm not interested. We wanted to show that this could be done safely, effectively, in a medically supervised way to create incredible outcomes. And that's exactly what we've done. So we've got 9 locations operating across North America, 3 in Canada, 6 in the US, providing ketamine assisted therapy. And our client base is primarily people who are struggling with depression, anxiety, PTSD, and the results we're generating are genuinely life-changing. On average, we see our clients go from severe depression and anxiety scores to mild depression and anxiety scores, and those benefits go out 6 months typically for most clients. So after 4 or 6 sessions, you get 6 months of substantial depression and anxiety relief. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing that comes close to offering that kind of outcome in any kind of mental health application right now. And the reason I think we've been so successful at doing this, whereas there are a number of other ketamine providers out there where usually reversion to mean happens about 3 weeks. We're at 6 months, is because of our focus actually of the topic of today, which is integration. Our protocols are very integration oriented. Prep sessions, you do the work with the ketamine. There's integration immediately afterwards, and then there's integration sessions, just pure non-medicine integration sessions interspersed between the whole protocol. And that's what I think drives those amazing outcomes relative to what everybody else is doing.
Mm. And so what does integration mean to you? Like what is it? Why would you do it? What's the importance of it?
So there's 2 lenses, I think, to it through which to look at that. One is just the emotional processing work, which is often people haven't heard of too many people having transform 3-hour energetic orgasms. I have heard a little bit about that, but not too often in our clinics. But usually what happens is people will have breakthroughs like I had. They have a realization that something's been in their operating system, something's been part of their modus operandi for all of their lives.
Mhm.
And like, oh shit, I haven't felt the anger or the sadness or the joy or whatever it may be around that event. This is what people often try to get through to meditation, or through meditation, or through just general therapy. But people get there fast. People get there after a session or 2, where it could take 6 months or longer with traditional therapy. So you've got that emotional processing going on right now, and so the integration is an opportunity to unpack it, talk about it, feel it is an important part of it. Um, and then try to translate it and reinterpret it and see it through a different lens, so it no longer carries the baggage that it once carried for you. So that's an important part of the integration, which is just the therapy part of it.
Mhm.
The other part of it is the neuroplasticity.
Mhm.
So what happens following a psychedelic experience with ketamine, with MDMA, with psilocybin, we've seen it across all of these now, is that your brain actually goes into a process called synaptogenesis or neurogenesis. It actually starts regrowing brain cells, in a very simplified way of saying that. And we also know that your brain tends to follow similar patterns. So if you have the same thought processes over and over, they can get more entrenched. So if you have depressive thoughts over and over, they get more entrenched and more entrenched. Psychedelics come in and they kind of throw fresh snow, as the analogy goes, over the ski tracks. And so the integration is also important, because not just of the emotional processing, but actually physiologically having different perspectives, feeling different feelings, having different thoughts over and over again can create new paths, positive paths, as opposed to the ones that you've been struggling with. And so part of the integration is actually triggering your brain to rewire itself in a much more constructive and healthy way than the patterns that you had adopted before. And so that's why integration is so important. You emotionally get through stuff, and then you actually create the physiology to support that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's like you could do one workout with a trainer and that would, tear the muscles, help grow the muscles, but if you don't know how to do the protocol on your own, like are you going to have the lasting benefit? I'll share a couple of
That's
personal
exactly
experiences.
it.
My first time ever doing ketamine, it was like a ceremonial setting. It was like 20 friends and someone was leading and we were journaling and it was for me it was very low dose. It was like 20 milligram lozenge. And so when I was in
Okay.
the journey, it was very like I kept being like, I wonder if it's going to hit. Is it happening yet? Like, am I there yet? Like I didn't feel a conscious change because I was blindfolded, eyes like laying down, dark eyes. So there was no real physical change. I felt quite lucid and present the whole time. And so afterwards I was like, okay, cool. Like I had a nice meditation, but I didn't feel like anything had happened. And 20 milligrams, for those of you who are new, is very, very low, is my understanding as far as dosing goes. For especially if you're
Yeah.
trying, if the point is to have a journey or to go on some sort of expanded experience. So anyway, but I went in with a very specific intention that I wanted to like rewrite the code, like my dad codes, because my dad was an alcoholic and angry and had a temper, and so I was like, there was a very specific line of code around my dad that was my intention. Who knows if your intention ever comes true, but at least to have one really changes the journey. And so afterwards, I was like, well, cool experience, but I certainly didn't rewrite any dad codes. And then afterwards, I was talking to two friends and having a conversation and just burst into tears and like into full fetal position, sobbing, crying, and was being held by these two masculine figures. And so even though it didn't, so in hours after the session, it felt like that rewriting, that neuroplasticity was able to take effect, even if it wasn't like in the session, or I didn't have like a massive download or like see the face of God when it was happening, but rather it was in the integration afterwards that I had the really profound healing, which leads me to the trip journal. So talk to us about this. Like, what is the goal of this? How do people use this? Like, what's your dream for the trip journal?
Yeah. The trip journal was designed really to give people a concrete, beautiful, physical way to do the work. I mean, I think you touched on something that's really important. It happened for you really quickly that you had this moment of revelation outside of the journey, but shortly thereafter. For some people, it takes weeks, months, even years before it happens, and it just bubbles through the surface kind of thing. And that's why the integration practice is so important. That I'm a big believer that integration is actually a lifelong process. As soon as you start it, you're never off that train. You can be more active or passive about it, but it's always on. In the direction of life, even a 1% change over time can create a significant shift in your life. And so the more conscious we are about it, the more active we are about it, the more we can direct that and create that impact. And so the idea with the trip journal was to give people a way to do that that's really simple and elegant and beautiful. And so it's designed into a number of different journeys where it helps you set an intention, like you
Mhm.
talked about beforehand, even though the journey will go where the journey will go, despite your best intentions sometimes.
Yeah.
It helps you record your feelings, just so you
Mm.
document it. And then it really invites you to come back day after day following your experience to continue to journal, to continue to record it in a conscious way so you can document it and go back to it and look at it and watch your evolution. I mean, it's really important from a journaling perspective. We talk about the science of journaling and how it actually translates into changes in your emotions and your physiology as well. But by writing it down, it creates an impact. It's a lot better than sitting there typing it out on your phone, as I'm sure many people know. And so just taking people through that process to keep coming back and keep doing the work. So it follows you for, a few days afterwards. And after day 7, it flips to day 14. And so it's just kind of like a 2-week guide, but you can keep coming back to it and use all the entries as often as you want.
I love that. I'll share this. There's a quote right in the beginning that is so beautiful. Like, your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. Carl Jung.
Mm.
Um, so that's so beautiful. So for those folks who have never, like, this is brand new, they've never heard of psychedelic assisted therapy, they don't know what ketamine is, that are maybe scared of it and have, like we all did in the 80s and the war on drugs, and we're thought that like this is the enemy, this is the devil, this is the gateway to hell, like you're gonna fry your brain, and they see the eggs in the frying pan, this is your brain on drugs. Um, I just this today I posted something where they were doing the research of like fatalities due to substances, and like alcohol is like up here, and then like the very bottom is like ketamine and mushrooms. And obviously
Yeah.
part of that has to do with like driving usage, numbers of people. But can you just speak to those people who might be scared or might not understand it, or like anything that's assuaged your assumptions or fears, or people that you've seen who were scared when they started?
Sure. First, I would say is that you have a fellow compatriot. I didn't do drugs or drink through high school or university until midway through university. I discovered the joys of alcohol, but even then, all drugs were kind of verboten, and I was not okay with them and scared of them for a number of reasons. I said what most people who are interested in doing psychedelics say, which is like, I'm not interested in losing control that way. That scares me. And when in fact, usually what you do need is the feeling of letting go of control. But it's a
Control
whole
is an
different
illusion
conversation.
anyway.
Um, yeah. And so, what you need to know is just about everything we learned in high school about psychedelics is either a gross exaggeration or an outright lie. And that's just not my opinion. That's pretty documented. So the study I think you were referring to is actually a study in the Lancet, which was published by Professor David Nutt. David Nutt was actually hired to be the equivalent of the drug czar in the UK. So he was the guy brought in to enforce drug policy and drug regulation, but he didn't want to take a policy-based approach to it. He wanted to take a science-based approach to it. So he did the work and analyzed, I think there's about 27 different drugs on there. He
Mhm.
found that alcohol was the most dangerous in terms of harm to self and harm to others. And right at the bottom, at the very least harmful, was psilocybin. And that includes benzos and some other pharmaceutical drugs in there as well. That psilocybin and LSD were at the very bottom. MDMA was close to the bottom. Ketamine was close to the bottom. Most of them were below cannabis, which many people generally regard as safe right now. So these molecules are safe. It's almost impossible to overdose on most of these drugs. The LD50 is either non-existent or so high it's unreasonable to ever worry about that. Notions that they fry your brain. In fact, we see the opposite, as I mentioned, that after ketamine or MDMA or psilocybin, we actually see synaptogenesis and neurogenesis. Your brain actually starts to heal itself. It's not getting destroyed. The exact opposite of what we learned. Now, I don't want to overstate the positives. There's lots of positives, and I can talk about the data, and I'll talk about that in 1 second. There are some risks associated with them. It's not really a pharmacological risk. It's not really a physiological risk. It's a risk of having a challenging experience that you go into a psilocybin journey or a ketamine journey and something really challenging, an emotional challenge comes up, or you have a memory from a childhood that you had blocked out, and that can be hard. Now, that can be incredibly cathartic and can lead to amazing breakthroughs. But if you're not supported well, if you don't have a good guide or a good therapist with you, it can actually kind of go sideways. And so that's why it's important to do the integration work. It's the reason that you need to be supported during these journeys. And if you are, then the outcomes are fabulous. I touched on the outcomes we're generating at Field Trip. We see studies with MDMA, which show that MDMA-assisted therapy is effectively curing about 75% of PTSD patients in the trials, whereas
Wow.
current medications try to seek a 30% improvement in symptoms versus a 75% cure rate. We're seeing amazing outcomes. And in that trial, there were no severe adverse events reported. So
Mm.
safe, effective. That's really the nuts and bolts of it. And our documentary is now tentatively called Everybody is Doing Drugs. And it's because it really is becoming quite mainstream. Not to say that you should do things from a peer pressure perspective, but if you look around and talk to people, you'll probably find that a lot of people are exploring work with psychedelics in a very productive, healthy, and positive way.
Yeah, and I think with anything, like water can kill you. You know, you can poison yourself with water. A lot of it is it's set and
Yeah.
setting, its dosage, its intention, and certainly integration. So thank you for making this the trip journal. So if people wanted to explore psychedelic assisted therapy or ketamine assisted therapy, where would they start, and then where do they go to get the book?
Sure. Easiest place to start is to look up Field Trip. So on socials at Field Trip Health, fieldtriphealth.com is our website. Lots of information on there. You can follow me for all of my ridiculous antics and stories about psychedelics. My socials are at Ronan D. Levvy, D as in David. Trip Journal, thetripjournal.com is the website. You can pick it up there, or it's on Amazon or any other fabulous bookstores that may be available.
Amazing. Well, again, thank you for bravely heeding the call and thank you for stepping into this uncharted territory. I know that, we're dealing with such a mental health crisis right now, and it's so important that people have tools and ways out. And one thing that I'll just note for ketamine assisted therapy, and correct me if I'm wrong, but for MDMA, you have to get off of your SSRIs, and that can be a really intense titration process, especially for parents. And so with ketamine, you don't have to get off your SSRIs in order to do it. Is that correct?
That is correct. I mean, the studies seem to suggest that the risks associated with titrating off antidepressants for MDMA and psilocybin assisted therapy aren't very significant. It's probably more that it just blunts the impact of the psilocybin or MDMA. It doesn't create additional risks, seems to be the evidence, but there's no risks with ketamine because it's actually acting on different receptors in the brain. So there's no
Okay.
problem whatsoever
So it's
keeping
not
on
necessarily
conventional
like
medications.
a danger. Like if I was on SSRIs and I wanted to do MDMA assisted therapy, it's not necessarily that I would be putting myself in danger, but I might not have as effective results. Is that correct?
That's correct. I can say that with more confidence about psilocybin. I'm not as sure with MDMA, but I'm pretty sure that's the case as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that. So, y'all, if you are curious about this, I would definitely recommend checking out Field Trip, checking out the Trip Journal. Obviously do your research. This is not a recommendation or endorsement. It is just like know that this work is happening. Know that there are alternatives that are different than that we grew up believing. And so, Ronan, thank you for forging the way and for making this more accessible to more people because I know that you're experiencing firsthand the level of healing. And the thing that I'll just share is that, the more you're meditating on the front and on the back end, that is going to really help your preparation, your integration, because you're already changing your state of consciousness every day internally. When you have that sort of bigger shift in consciousness, it doesn't feel as scary. It's easier for you to integrate. And because you already have that neuroplasticity from the meditation, it's just you're building on it and making like it's the reason why I was able to integrate in that same night. It's not I'm not magic, I'm not special. It's just I've been doing this stuff for a long time. So it's like when I work with medicine, I'm very, very receptive. And so it can just, they can really blend quite beautifully together. So thank you so much, Ronan. Thank you everyone for listening. And I'm really excited about what's next and where we're heading.
Thank you for having me. It's
My
been
pleasure.
so nice chatting and nice to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you too. All right, bye everyone.